The last time I saw my parents before they disappeared from my life, my suitcase was sitting on the front porch, half zipped, my clothes spilling out onto the concrete like something nobody wanted to claim, and my mother stood in the doorway refusing to even look at me, while my father told me I was no longer welcome in his house because I had embarrassed them beyond repair. And I remember standing there at 17, pregnant, shaking in the cold evening air, realizing I wasn't just losing my home, I was being erased. Years later, those same people showed up unannounced at a military ceremony, smiling like nothing had ever happened, asking to see the grandson they believed I had been raising all this time, and what they found instead left them completely speechless. If you've ever felt abandoned by the people who were supposed to protect you, or if this story speaks to your heart in any way, take a moment to like, subscribe, and share where you're watching from, along with your local time. Only if this story truly resonates with you, because I want to know how far this story reaches and who it connects with. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 32 years old, and this is the night my family finally faced the truth they spent years avoiding. The night everything they believed about me and about themselves fell apart. But to understand how it got to that point, you have to go back to where it all began. When I was still just a high school junior, trying to hold my life together in a house that looked perfect from the outside, but felt like walking on thin ice every single day, where every mistake mattered more than who you were, and every achievement still somehow wasn't enough. And back then, I thought if I just followed the rules, kept my head down, and made my parents proud, I would always have a place there. I would always belong. But I didn't understand yet that in my family, love was conditional. And the moment I stopped fitting the image they had created for me, I would become someone they didn't recognize, someone they didn't want. And the worst part wasn't even what they said that night or how quickly they turned their backs on me. It was how easy it seemed for them to let me go, like I had never really been theirs to begin with. And I didn't know it yet, standing there on that porch with nowhere to go. But that moment, the one where the door closed behind me, was the beginning of everything that came after, everything that would change who I was, and everything that would eventually bring them back to my doorstep, not because they missed me, but because they thought I still had something they could take. Back then, everything in our house looked calm if you did not look too closely, like one of those model homes where every pillow is perfectly placed but nobody actually lives there. And I spent most of my time trying to stay invisible between my father's expectations and my mother's constant quiet disappointment. Because in our house, silence did not mean peace, it meant you had not messed up yet. And I had learned early that staying out of trouble was the only way to survive. My dad believed in structure, in discipline, in the idea that success was the only acceptable outcome, and my mom followed his lead in everything, not loudly, not aggressively, but in a way that made it clear there was no second opinion in that house. And I was the oldest, which meant I was supposed to set the example, the one who got the grades, stayed out of trouble, and made them look good in front of everyone else, especially at church and family gatherings, where image seemed to matter more than anything real. My younger sister, Hannah, could get away with things I never could. She had this way of making mistakes feel small, forgivable, like they did not define her, while every choice I made felt like it was being measured, evaluated, and stored away for later. And I did not resent her for it. Not at first. I just told myself that was how things were. That maybe I was stronger, maybe I could handle more, maybe that was why they expected more from me, and I clung to that idea because the alternative was too painful to admit. I remember sitting at the kitchen table most nights, textbooks spread out in front of me, trying to stay ahead in every class, because falling behind was not an option, not in that house, and my father would walk by, glance at my work, and nod just slightly, like approval was something you had to earn daily, and could lose just as quickly. And I lived for those small moments, those barely noticeable signs that I was doing enough, that I was still acceptable, but it was never really about me. It was about what I represented to them, and I did not realize how fragile that position was until everything started to shift. It began quietly, with a feeling I could not ignore, a constant exhaustion that did not make sense. Mornings where getting out of bed felt heavier than usual, and I told myself it was stress, that it was just school, just pressure, just life. But deep down I knew something was off, something I could not explain. And I kept it to myself because I was afraid of what it might mean, afraid of what would happen if I could not control it. And in our house, control was everything. Weeks went by like that, Me, pretending everything was normal, smiling when I needed to, answering questions the right way, keeping up appearances, until one afternoon after school, sitting alone in the bathroom with a cheap test I had bought with cash so there would be no record, no trace, no question. I saw the result that made my entire world stop, and I remember staring at it, my hands shaking, my mind refusing to catch up to what my eyes were seeing, because it did not fit into the life I had been building. It did not fit into the version of me my parents believed in. And for a long time I just sat there on the cold tile floor, trying to figure out how something so small could destroy everything at once. I did not tell anyone at first, not my friends, not my family, not even the person who should have been involved, because I needed time. Time to think, time to understand, time to decide what to do next. But time did not feel like something I actually had, because every day I went home, I could feel the weight of it growing, like I was carrying a secret that was too heavy for someone my age, and the hardest part was pretending nothing had changed, sitting at dinner across from my parents, answering their questions, nodding at the right moments, while inside I was falling apart, and I kept thinking maybe I could fix it before they ever found out. Maybe I could handle it quietly. Maybe I could protect myself from what I already knew was coming. But I did not understand yet that some truths do not stay hidden, and when they come out, they do not just change your life. They reveal who people really are. And I had no idea just how quickly everything I thought I knew about my family was about to collapse. The secret did not explode all at once the way I had feared. It unraveled slowly, like something already broken finally giving in. And the moment it started, I knew there was no way to stop it. It happened on a Sunday evening, the kind of evening where everything in our house followed a routine so predictable it felt rehearsed. Dinner at exactly 6 o'clock, my father at the head of the table, my mother serving plates without saying much, Hannah scrolling through her phone until she was told to put it away, and me trying to act like my heart was not racing so hard I could barely hear anything else, because I had decided that night I was going to tell them, not because I felt ready, but because hiding it was becoming impossible. And I kept thinking maybe if I said it carefully, maybe if I explained it the right way, they would still see me, not just the mistake. I barely touched my food, pushing it around my plate while my father talked about work and expectations and discipline, words that suddenly felt heavier than they ever had before, and my mother nodded along, occasionally glancing at me like she could already sense something was off, and maybe she did. Maybe she had always been better at reading what was not being said, but she never spoke up, not when it mattered. When dinner ended and my father stood up to clear his plate, I heard myself say his name before I could change my mind, my voice quieter than I expected, and both of them stopped, turning toward me in a way that made my chest tighten instantly because I knew this was it. There was no going back now. I told them I needed to talk, and even that felt like too much, like I had already done something wrong just by asking for their attention outside of their terms, and we moved into the living room where everything felt too clean, too controlled, like there was no room for what I was about to say. And for a few seconds nobody spoke, and I could feel the silence pressing in on me, waiting, demanding. When I finally said the words, they did not sound real, not even to me. It felt like I was repeating something I had heard about someone else, something distant, something that could not possibly belong to me. And for a moment after I finished, there was nothing, no reaction, no immediate response, just this strange pause where everything seemed suspended. And I remember thinking maybe it was not as bad as I thought. Maybe they were processing it. Maybe they were going to ask if I was okay. Maybe they were going to help me figure out what to do next. But that moment did not last. My father was the first to react, not loudly at first, but in a way that felt colder than anything I had ever heard from him, like disappointment had replaced whatever version of love I thought was there. And he asked me if I understood what I had done, not how I felt, not what I needed, just what I had done. And I tried to explain. I tried to tell him I was scared, that I did not know what to do, that I needed them. But the more I spoke, the more his expression changed, like every word I said only confirmed something he had already decided about me. My mother did not interrupt him. She did not step in. She did not ask me a single question. She just sat there, looking at me in a way I could not read, and somehow that hurt even more, because it felt like she had already accepted whatever was about to happen next. Then came the words I had not prepared for, the ones that made everything inside me drop, My father said I had brought shame into his house, that I had disrespected everything he had worked for, everything he had built, and I remember trying to hold on to something, anything, that would tell me I was still his daughter, that I still belonged there, but there was nothing in his voice that sounded like that anymore. I kept thinking if I could just say the right thing, if I could just make him understand that I was still me, that I had not changed, that I was still trying. But every attempt felt like it was hitting a wall that had already been built, and I realized then that this was not a conversation, it was a judgment, and the decision had already been made before I even opened my mouth. My hands were shaking so badly I had to hold them together just to keep them still, and I remember saying I would take responsibility, that I would figure it out, that I would not let it ruin everything, but even as I said it, I could see it did not matter, because in their eyes it already had. And the worst part was not what they were saying, it was the way they were looking at me, like I had become something unfamiliar, something they did not recognize, something they did not want to be associated with anymore. I did not know it yet, sitting there in that room that had once felt like home, but that was the moment everything shifted. Not when I found out, not when I told them, but when I realized that the people I thought would stand beside me had already stepped away, and what came next was not going to be about fixing anything. It was going to be about losing everything I thought I still had. My father did not raise his voice right away, and somehow that made everything feel worse, because the calm in his tone carried a kind of finality I had never heard before, like he had already closed the door on me in his mind, and was just waiting for the right moment to say it out loud. And when he finally did speak again, it was not to ask questions or understand what had happened, it was to make it clear that, in his eyes, I had crossed a line that could not be undone. He told me that everything he had worked for, every sacrifice he had made, every expectation he had placed on me, had been wasted, and the way he said it made it sound like I was not his daughter anymore, but a problem he needed to remove, something that threatened the image he had spent years building. And I remember looking at my mother, hoping she would interrupt him, hoping she would say something, anything, that sounded like care, but she stayed quiet, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes avoiding mine like if she did not look at me directly, she would not have to take responsibility for what was happening. I tried to explain again, my voice breaking despite how hard I was trying to keep it steady, telling them I was scared, that I needed their help, that I did not want to go through this alone, but my words felt like they were disappearing the second they left my mouth, like they were not even being heard. And that was the moment I understood that this was not about me anymore. It was about how I made them look, how my situation reflected on them, and there was no version of this where they chose me over that. My father stood up then, walking a few steps away, before turning back toward me with a look I had never seen before. Not anger, not even disappointment, but something colder, something distant. And he told me that I had made my choices and now I would have to live with them, and I remember the exact way my stomach dropped when he said those words, because I knew what was coming even before he said it. I could feel it building in the silence that followed. He said I could not stay there anymore, that he would not allow that kind of situation under his roof, that he had a responsibility to protect his home, his reputation, his family, and the way he said family made it clear I was no longer included in that word, and for a second I just sat there, unable to move, unable to process how quickly everything had shifted from a conversation to a decision that would change my entire life. I asked him where I was supposed to go, and even as I said it, I hated how small my voice sounded, how much it revealed how unprepared I was for this, and he did not answer right away, which somehow made it worse, because it meant he either did not care or had not even considered it, and when he finally did respond, he said that was not his concern anymore, that I needed to figure it out, just like I had figured everything else out on my own, and there was something in that moment that broke inside me, something quiet but permanent, because I realized I had never actually been safe there, not in the way I thought I was. My mother finally spoke then, but not in the way I had hoped, not to defend me or soften what was happening, but to agree with him in a voice so calm it felt almost detached, saying that maybe this would teach me responsibility, that maybe this was what I needed. And I remember staring at her, trying to reconcile the woman sitting in front of me with the idea of a mother I had held onto for so long, and I could not find any connection between the two. Hannah was standing in the hallway by then, watching everything, and even she did not say anything. She just looked at me with a mix of confusion and distance, like she was already adjusting to a version of the family where I was no longer part of it, and that hurt in a way I could not even explain, because it made everything feel even more final, even more real. I do not remember standing up. I do not remember deciding to go to my room, but suddenly I was there, looking around at everything that had once felt like mine, trying to understand how it could all disappear so quickly, how a life could be packed into a few bags in less than an hour, and my hands moved automatically, grabbing clothes, a few personal things, anything that felt important enough to take, but nothing really felt like enough, because what I was losing was not something I could fit into a suitcase. I kept waiting for something to change, for someone to come in and say they had gone too far, that we could figure it out, that I could stay, but no one came, and the silence in that house felt louder than anything I had ever heard before, like it was confirming that this was really happening, that I was really being sent away, and I did not know it yet. But that night was not just about being forced out of a house. It was about being cut off from everything I had ever known, everything I had believed would always be there, and as I zipped up my bag with shaking hands, I realized that whatever happened next, I would be facing it completely alone, and that was something I had never been prepared for. The moment I stepped out of that house with my bag in my hand, the night air felt colder than it should have, like the world outside had already decided I did not belong anywhere anymore, and I stood there on the front porch for a few seconds longer than I should have, not because I thought they would change their minds, but because part of me still needed to believe they might, that maybe the door would open behind me and my mother would call my name, or my father would tell me to come back inside and we would figure it out together. But nothing happened. The door stayed closed. The lights inside stayed on like everything was normal, like I had not just been removed from that life completely, and that silence was louder than anything they had said. I remember walking down the driveway slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last, like I was leaving something behind that I could never get back, and when I reached the street, I stopped again, looking back at the house I had grown up in, trying to memorize it in a way I had never done before, because deep down I already knew I was not coming back, not the way I had left it, not as the same person, and that realization settled in quietly but firmly, like something final. I did not have a plan, I did not have a place to go, and I did not have anyone I felt I could call without explaining everything. I was not ready to explain, so I started walking, just moving forward because standing still felt worse, because thinking too much felt dangerous, and the only thing keeping me together in that moment was the idea that if I just kept going, something would eventually make sense, something would fall into place, but nothing did, not right away. The streets felt different at night, quieter but also more exposed, like every passing car could see me, like everyone who looked in my direction could somehow tell that I did not have a home to go back to, and I kept my head down, gripping the handle of my bag so tightly my hands started to ache, because letting go of anything in that moment felt like losing control completely, and control was the only thing I had left. I ended up sitting on a bench near a closed convenience store after walking for what felt like miles, even though it could not have been more than a couple of blocks, and I remember staring at the ground, trying to process everything that had just happened, replaying every word, every look, every moment leading up to it, as if there was something I could have said differently, something I could have done to change the outcome. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that it had never really been about what I said. It had been decided the moment I no longer fit into the version of me they wanted, and that thought made something inside me go quiet. Not peaceful, not calm, just empty in a way that was easier to handle than the panic. I checked my phone more than once, not because I had received any messages, but because I kept expecting one, something from my mom, maybe a simple question, maybe a sign that she was reconsidering, but there was nothing. No calls, no texts, no missed attempts to reach me, and that silence confirmed what I had been trying not to fully accept, that they were not going to come after me, they were not going to check if I was safe, they were not going to ask where I was, and that realization hurt more than being told to leave, because it meant they were choosing to let me go. I thought about going to a friend's house, running through names in my head, imagining how that conversation would go, what I would say when they asked why I showed up with a bag in the middle of the night, and every scenario felt like too much, too complicated, too exposing, and I was not ready to see that look on someone else's face, that mix of concern and judgment that I had already seen at home, so I stayed where I was, telling myself it was temporary, that I just needed a few hours to think, to figure something out, to come up with a plan that made sense. Time moved differently that night, slower but also heavier, like every minute carried more weight than it should have, and I remember pulling my jacket tighter around me, trying to stay warm, trying to stay focused, trying not to let my mind drift too far into what this meant for the future, because the future suddenly felt too big, too uncertain, and I could barely handle the present. But that was not even the hardest part. The hardest part was realizing that there was no one coming to fix this. No adult stepping in, no safety net appearing at the last second, no one saying this had gone too far, because the people who were supposed to be that safety net had already made their decision. And now everything depended on me, whether I was ready or not, and I did not know it yet, sitting there alone under the dim light of a closed store. But that night was not just the lowest point of my life. It was the moment I stopped waiting for someone else to save me, even though I had no idea how I was going to save myself. By the time the sky started to lighten just a little at the edge of the horizon, I realized I could not sit there forever pretending this was just a pause, because nothing about my situation was temporary anymore, and the longer I stayed frozen in that moment, the more real everything became. So I stood up, my legs stiff and my mind still heavy, and I told myself I needed to move, not because I had a clear plan, but because standing still meant accepting that I had nowhere to go. And I was not ready to fully admit that yet. The first thing I did was check how much money I had, sitting back down for a second and opening my wallet with hands that still felt unsteady, counting bills slowly like the number might change if I took my time. And it was not much, just enough to maybe get through a couple of days if I was careful, if nothing unexpected happened. And that thought alone made my chest tighten again, because everything about my life had just become unpredictable. I walked into the convenience store when it opened, trying to act normal, trying to look like someone who belonged there, not someone who had spent the entire night outside because she had nowhere else to go. And I bought a bottle of water and a small snack, not because I was hungry, but because I needed to do something that felt ordinary, something that grounded me in reality. And when the cashier handed me my change without even looking at me twice, I felt a strange kind of relief, like maybe I could still pass as someone who had not just lost everything. I sat outside again, taking small sips of water, trying to think clearly, trying to map out my next steps, and the truth was, I did not have many options, but one thought kept coming back to me, something I had pushed aside the night before because I did not want to deal with what it meant, and that was the idea of asking for help, not from my family, because that door was already closed, but from someone else, someone who might not judge me the same way, someone who might actually see me instead of what I represented. I thought about my school counselor, someone who had always seemed patient, someone who had once told me that if I ever needed anything, I could come to her, and at the time, it had felt like something people just say, something polite, something you never actually use, but now it was the only option that made any sense. And even then, the idea of walking into that office and explaining everything made my stomach twist, because it meant saying it out loud again. It meant making it real in a way I was still trying to avoid. But I knew I could not keep avoiding it, because avoiding it was how I ended up on that bench in the first place, and if I wanted anything to change, I had to face it, even if it was uncomfortable, even if it was hard, even if it meant letting someone see me at my lowest. The walk to school felt longer than it ever had before, every step filled with hesitation, every passing minute giving me another chance to turn around, to pretend none of this was happening, to go back to that bench and wait for something to magically fix itself. But I kept going, because deep down I knew there was no going back. Not anymore. When I finally reached the building, everything looked exactly the same as it always had. Students walking in, laughing, talking about things that suddenly felt so far away from my reality. And for a second, I just stood there, watching, feeling like I was looking at a life I used to be part of but no longer belonged to. And that feeling hit me harder than I expected, because it made everything even more real, even more permanent. I walked inside slowly, keeping my head down, hoping no one would stop me, hoping no one would ask questions. I was not ready to answer, and somehow I made it to the counseling office without being noticed. And when I knocked on the door, My hand hesitated for just a second before making contact, like part of me was still trying to hold on to the last bit of control I had left. When she opened the door and saw me standing there with my bag, with my tired eyes, with everything I was trying to hide written all over my face, her expression changed immediately, not to judgment, not to disappointment, but to concern, real concern. And that alone almost made me break, because it was the first time since everything happened that someone looked at me like I mattered. She did not ask too many questions at first. She just invited me in, gave me a place to sit, and that small act of kindness felt bigger than anything I had experienced in the past 24 hours, because it reminded me that maybe not everyone was going to turn their back on me. Maybe not everyone saw me the way my parents did, and that thought, as small as it was, gave me just enough strength to start talking, even though my voice was unsteady, even though I was still trying to process everything myself, and I did not know it yet, sitting in that office with someone who was willing to listen. But this was the moment where everything began to shift, not in a dramatic way, not all at once, but in a quiet and steady way that would eventually lead me somewhere I never expected, even if at that moment I could not see it yet. At first, I could not say everything out loud, not all at once, because every sentence felt like it carried too much weight, like if I said it too clearly it would become even more real than it already was. So I started small, explaining just enough for her to understand that I could not go home, that I did not have anywhere else to go, and even that was hard, because it meant admitting something I had spent my entire life trying to avoid, that I was not okay, that I needed help. She listened without interrupting, without rushing me, without trying to fix everything immediately, and that alone made it easier to keep going, because for the first time since everything happened, I did not feel like I was being judged or evaluated. I felt like I was being heard, and that was something I did not even realize I needed until that moment. When I finally told her the truth about being pregnant, I braced myself for a reaction similar to my parents', for that shift in expression, for that moment where concern turns into disappointment, but it never came. She stayed calm, steady, focused on me instead of the situation, and she asked me how I was feeling, not what I had done, not what I should have done differently, but how I was feeling right now. And that question caught me off guard in a way I was not prepared for, because I had not allowed myself to think about that. I had been so focused on surviving the reaction that I had ignored my own emotions completely. I told her I was scared, and even that felt like an understatement, because it was more than fear, it was uncertainty, it was isolation, it was the realization that everything I thought was stable had disappeared overnight. But saying it out loud was a start, and she nodded in a way that made it clear she understood, not completely, not in a way that erased what I was going through, but enough to make me feel less alone. She began explaining options, slowly, carefully, like she did not want to overwhelm me, talking about temporary housing programs for students, about support systems I had never even known existed, about ways to keep me in school, so I would not lose everything I had worked for. And every word she said felt like a small step back from the edge I had been standing on, because for the first time since the night before, I could see something ahead of me that was not just uncertainty, but that was not the part that stayed with me the most. What stayed with me was the moment she said something simple, something that should not have felt as powerful as it did. She said that what I was going through did not define my entire future. That one moment, no matter how overwhelming, did not erase who I was or what I could still become. And I remember sitting there, hearing those words, and feeling something shift inside me, something small but important, because it was the first time anyone had said anything that gave me permission to believe that this was not the end of everything. Still, even with that, there was a part of me that kept waiting for something to go wrong, for the support to disappear, for the situation to collapse the same way everything else had, because I had already learned how quickly things could change, and trusting anything felt risky. But I stayed. I listened. I let her help me take the first steps towards something that resembled stability, even if it was fragile. She helped me contact a local program that provided temporary housing for young people, in situations like mine. And within a few hours, I had a place to go, not permanent, not comfortable, but safe. And that word alone meant more than anything else at that point, because safety was something I had lost without even realizing how much I depended on it. When I arrived there later that day, carrying the same bag I had packed in a rush the night before, everything felt unfamiliar. the walls, the people, the quiet hum of a place filled with stories similar to mine, and for a moment I felt out of place again, like I had stepped into a life I did not recognize. But this time it was different, because I was not being pushed out, I was being allowed in, and that difference mattered more than I could fully understand at the time. I lay awake that night in a bed that was not mine, staring at a ceiling I had never seen before, listening to the distant sounds of people moving through their own struggles, and I realized that nothing about my life was going to go back to the way it was. Not my family, not my home, not the version of myself I used to be. And for the first time, instead of trying to hold on to that old version, I started to understand that I might have to become someone new entirely, someone who did not rely on the same things, someone who could stand on her own even when everything else was uncertain. And that thought was both terrifying and strangely steady at the same time, because it meant that even though I had lost everything I thought I needed, there was still a chance, however small, that I could build something else, something that belonged to me, even if I had no idea yet what that would look like. The days that followed did not feel like a fresh start, the way people sometimes describe new beginnings. They felt more like learning how to breathe again after being underwater for too long, slow, uneven, and uncertain. And every morning I woke up in that unfamiliar bed. There was a split second where I forgot everything, where I expected to hear the normal sounds of my old life, my mother moving around in the kitchen, my father getting ready for work, the quiet routine that used to define my days. And then it would all come rushing back, not in a dramatic way, but in a steady, heavy realization that this was my reality now, that nothing about my life was the same anymore. I kept going to school because it was the one thing I could still hold on to, the one place where I could pretend, even if just for a few hours, that I was still the same person I had been before everything fell apart. But even that felt different, because I was carrying something no one else could see. Something that separated me from everyone around me, and every conversation, every laugh, every normal moment felt slightly out of reach, like I was watching it happen instead of being part of it. The program I was staying in had rules, structure, expectations, but it was not suffocating the way my home had been. It was different. It was built to help, not control, and that difference showed in small ways, in how people spoke to me, in how they asked what I needed, instead of telling me what I had done wrong. And even though I did not fully trust it at first, I started to settle into it, slowly, carefully, like I was testing whether it was safe to rely on something again. I had regular check-ins with a counselor there, and for the first time, I started to talk about things I had never said out loud, not just about what had happened with my parents, but about how I felt growing up, the pressure, the expectations, the constant need to be perfect, just to feel accepted. And the more I spoke, the more I began to see patterns I had never noticed before, things that had always been there but that I had never questioned, because I thought that was just how families worked. That was just what love looked like. But that was not the hardest part. The hardest part came a few weeks later, when something shifted physically, something I could not ignore, and I remember sitting in a small clinic room, staring at the floor as a doctor explained what was happening in careful, gentle terms. And even though she spoke calmly, even though she tried to make it as clear and supportive as possible, the words still felt distant, like they were echoing from somewhere far away. Because what she was telling me meant that the future I had been trying to prepare myself for was changing again, in a way I had not expected. I walked out of that appointment feeling lighter and heavier at the same time. Lighter because one kind of fear had been removed, but heavier because it left behind something else, something harder to define. A quiet kind of grief mixed with confusion, because even though everything had been overwhelming, it had still been real. It had still been part of my story, and now it was gone in a way that felt both relieving and unsettling. I did not tell anyone right away, not even the counselor who had been helping me through everything, because I needed time to understand what I was feeling, time to process it without someone else putting words to it. And I carried that silence with me for a while, going through my days as if nothing had changed, even though internally, everything had shifted again. But what I did not expect was how that moment would change the way I saw my past, how it would slowly begin to separate me from the version of myself my parents had rejected, because for the first time, I realized that the thing they had defined me by, the thing they had used as the reason to push me out, was no longer even there. And yet the consequences of their decisions still remained, still shaped my life in ways they would never fully understand. I started to think about what would have happened if things had been different, if they had chosen to stay, if they had chosen me instead of their image, and that thought used to hurt in a sharp, immediate way, but now it felt different, more distant, more like something I could observe instead of something that controlled me, and I did not know it yet. But that shift was the beginning of something important, because it meant I was starting to separate my identity from their expectations, from their approval, from the version of me they had tried to define. And even though I was still figuring everything out, still building something uncertain and new, there was a quiet strength beginning to form underneath it all, something steady, something that did not rely on anyone else's acceptance. And that was something I had never had before. Not in my old life, not in that house, not even in myself, and I did not realize it at the time, but that quiet strength was going to be the thing that carried me forward, the thing that would eventually bring me face to face with the people who had once turned their backs on me, only this time, everything would be different. Time did not heal everything the way people like to say it does. It just gave me enough distance to see things more clearly, and as the months turned into years, I stopped measuring my life by what I had lost and started focusing on what I was building, piece by piece, decision by decision, even when those decisions were difficult or uncertain. I finished high school not because it was easy, but because I refused to let that part of my life define the rest of it. And every late night, every early morning, every moment where I felt like giving up became part of something bigger, something that belonged to me instead of to the expectations I had grown up under. And when graduation came, there was no one in the audience cheering for me, no familiar faces, no family waiting with cameras or proud smiles. But there was something else instead, something quieter but stronger, a sense that I had done it on my own, that I had carried myself through something I was never supposed to survive alone. After that, I made a decision that surprised even me. I enlisted not because it was part of some long-term plan I had always dreamed of, but because it offered structure, purpose, and a path forward that did not depend on anyone else's approval. And stepping into that world was like stepping into a completely different version of myself, one that was not defined by what had happened to me, but by what I was capable of doing next. The training was intense, demanding in ways I had never experienced before, but there was something about it that felt right, something about being pushed to my limits physically and mentally that made everything else feel more manageable. Like if I could get through this, I could get through anything. And for the first time, the expectations placed on me were clear, fair, and based on effort rather than image. And that made all the difference. I did not talk about my past there, not in detail, not in a way that invited questions, because I was not looking for sympathy. I was building something new, something solid, and I wanted to be seen for who I was becoming, not for what I had been through. And slowly, over time, I earned respect, not because of where I came from, but because of what I did, because of how I showed up, because I learned to rely on myself in ways I never had before. Promotions came, responsibilities grew, and with each step forward, the distance between me and my old life became more real, more defined, until it felt like something that had happened to someone else, something I could remember without being pulled back into it completely, and that was a kind of freedom I had never known. But even as my life moved forward, there were moments, small and unexpected, where the past would surface, not in a way that controlled me, but in a way that reminded me of where I had started. And one of those moments came years later, on a day that was supposed to be about recognition, about achievement, about everything I had built since then, a day where I stood in uniform, surrounded by people who respected me, who knew me for who I was now, not who I had been before. The ceremony was formal, structured, filled with the kind of quiet pride that comes from years of effort finally being acknowledged. And I remember standing there, steady, composed, feeling something close to peace, something I had not allowed myself to feel for a long time, because peace had never felt permanent before. It had always felt like something that could be taken away at any moment. But that day, for the first time, it felt different. It felt earned. It felt real. And I let myself believe in it, just for a moment, until everything shifted in a way I had not expected. I saw them before they saw me, standing near the back of the crowd, slightly out of place but unmistakable. My parents, older than I remembered, but still carrying that same presence, and that same sense of certainty that had once defined everything in my life. And for a second, my mind went completely still. Not because I did not recognize them, but because I had never imagined this moment, never pictured them stepping back into my life like this, unannounced, uninvited, as if the years in between had not happened. They were not alone either. And the way they looked around, the way they carried themselves, it was not with hesitation or regret, it was with expectation. Like they belonged there, like they had a right to be part of this moment. And that alone told me everything I needed to know, because it meant they had not come to reconnect, they had come for something else. I felt a shift inside me then, not panic, not fear, but something steadier, something controlled, because I was not the same person they had left behind. I was not the girl standing on that porch with nowhere to go. And whatever this moment was going to become, I knew one thing for certain. I was not going to let it unfold the way they expected it to, because this time, I was the one in control, even if they did not realize it yet. For a few seconds, I did not move, not because I was afraid, but because I was calculating, because after everything I had been through, I had learned that moments like this were not about reacting, they were about choosing how the story would unfold, and I was not going to let them control it the way they had before. I kept my posture steady, my expression neutral, even as my eyes stayed on them, watching the way they scanned the crowd, the way my father adjusted his stance like he belonged there, like he had always been part of my life, and my mother standing just slightly behind him, her expression softer but still carrying that same quiet alignment with whatever he decided. And it struck me how familiar that dynamic still was, how unchanged they seemed, even after all these years. They spotted me a moment later, and I saw the recognition hit, not slowly, not uncertainly, but instantly, like they had never forgotten what I looked like. And yet there was something else in their expression too, something that felt less like relief and more like confirmation, like they had found what they were looking for. They started walking toward me without hesitation, weaving through the people around them, as if they had every right to be there, as if this moment belonged to them just as much as it belonged to me. And I stayed exactly where I was, not stepping forward, not closing the distance, because I needed them to come to me on my terms, not the other way around. When they finally reached me, there was no pause, no acknowledgement of the years that had passed, no hesitation in their voices. My father spoke first, his tone controlled but direct, asking how I had been as if we had spoken just last week, as if nothing had happened, and for a brief second, I almost could not process it, not because I did not understand what he was saying, but because of how easily he said it, how naturally he stepped back into a role he had abandoned, without ever addressing it. My mother followed with a small smile, the kind that used to mean reassurance but now felt unfamiliar, and she said they had been trying to find me for a long time, that they were proud of what I had accomplished, that they always knew I would do well, and each word landed in a way that felt carefully chosen, not spontaneous, not emotional, but intentional, like part of a narrative they had already decided to present. I listened without interrupting, without correcting them, because I wanted to hear it. I wanted to understand exactly how they were framing this moment, exactly what version of the past they were choosing to acknowledge, and more importantly, what they were choosing to ignore. It did not take long before the real reason surfaced, not directly, not at first, but in the way the conversation shifted, in the way their questions began to circle around something specific, something they were clearly building toward. And then my father said it, almost casually, asking about my child, asking how old he was now, asking when they could meet him, and there it was, the reason they were standing in front of me after all these years, not because they had missed me, not because they wanted to repair what had been broken, but because they believed there was something they could claim, something that connected them back to me in a way that benefited them. I felt something settle inside me then, not anger, not shock, but clarity, because in that moment, everything aligned, everything made sense. The lack of apology, the absence of accountability, the way they spoke as if time had erased their choices, it all pointed to the same truth. They had not changed. They had just found a reason to return. I let a small pause sit between us, just long enough to make them aware that I was not going to respond the way they expected, and I could see the shift in their expressions, the slight tension, the subtle confusion, because they were used to controlling conversations like this, used to setting the tone, and for the first time, they were not. I asked them what made them think they had the right to ask me that, and even though my voice stayed calm, steady, it carried something different now, something they were not familiar with. And for a moment, neither of them answered, because the question itself disrupted the version of reality they had walked in with. My mother tried to soften it, saying that they were family, that they had a right to know their grandchild, that time had passed, and things were different now, and I listened again, letting her finish, because the more they spoke, the clearer it became. They were not here to reconnect. They were here to access something they believed belonged to them, something they assumed I would eventually give them because of who they were. But I was not that person anymore. I was not the girl who stood there hoping for their approval, hoping for their acceptance. I was someone who had built a life without them, someone who had learned what it meant to stand alone and still move forward. And that changed everything. I looked at them then, really looked at them, not as my parents, not as the people who once defined my world, but as individuals standing in front of me expecting something they had not earned, and for the first time, I did not feel small, I did not feel uncertain, I felt steady, grounded in a way that made their expectations feel almost distant, almost irrelevant, and I realized that whatever happened next, whatever I chose to say, it was not going to be about them, it was going to be about me, about the truth I had carried for years, the truth they had never bothered to ask about, and I could see it already. They were not prepared for what was coming, because they still believed they were walking into a story they understood, and they had no idea they were about to hear something that would change everything they thought they knew. I let the silence stretch just long enough for them to feel it, long enough for their confidence to start shifting into something else, something less certain, because I could see it in their faces already, the expectation that I would eventually give them what they came for, that I would fall back into the role they remembered, the version of me who explained herself, who tried to earn her place, who still believed their approval mattered. But that version of me did not exist anymore, and what they were about to hear was not something they had prepared for. I took a slow breath, not because I was nervous, but because I wanted to be precise, because after years of carrying this truth quietly, I was not going to rush it now, and when I finally spoke, my voice was calm, steady, controlled in a way that made every word land exactly where I intended it to. I told them there was no child, and for a moment, neither of them reacted, not because they understood, but because they did not, because the sentence did not fit into the story they had already built in their minds, and I could see it happening in real time, the confusion, the pause, the attempt to reinterpret what I had just said into something that made sense to them. My father frowned slightly, asking what I meant, as if there had to be some explanation that aligned with his expectations, some detail he was missing. And I held his gaze when I repeated it, this time more clearly, more directly, that there had never been a child for them to meet, and that was when it finally landed, not all at once, but in pieces, like something cracking slowly instead of breaking instantly. My mother's expression changed first, the confidence fading into something uncertain, something that looked almost like disbelief. And she asked if something had happened, her voice softer now, searching for a version of the truth that still allowed her to hold on to the narrative she had walked in with, and I could hear it in the way she phrased it, not asking about me, not asking how I had been, but asking about the child, still centering the conversation around something that had never been the real story. I told them what happened, not in detail, not emotionally, just the facts, that the pregnancy had ended, that it had happened years ago, that there was no grandson waiting for them anywhere, and I watched as that information settled over them, removing the foundation of everything they had come here for. But that was not the part that mattered most, not to me, because the truth about the child was only one layer, only one part of what they needed to understand. And I could see already that they were still trying to adjust, still trying to reposition themselves in this conversation, still trying to find a way to regain control of it. My father straightened slightly, his tone shifting again, less certain now but still holding on to authority, saying that regardless of what happened, we were still family, that it did not change the fact that they had a right to be in my life. And that was when I felt it clearly, the final piece of clarity that had been building since the moment I saw them walk into that ceremony, because even now, even after everything, they were still approaching this the same way, still believing that time erased accountability, still believing that their role as my parents automatically granted them access to me, to my life, to whatever I had built without them. I shook my head slightly, not in anger, not in frustration, but in certainty. And I told them that the child was never the point, that it never had been, that what mattered was what they did when I needed them. Once I stood in front of them at 17 asking for help, and they chose to turn me away, and as I said it, I could feel the weight of that moment, not as something that hurt anymore, but as something that defined the boundary I had built since then. I reminded them, calmly, clearly, that they had not asked where I went, they had not checked if I was safe, they had not tried to reach out, not once, and that silence had lasted years, not days, not weeks, but years. And that was not something that could be undone by showing up now with questions about a grandchild that did not exist. My mother's eyes shifted then, something in her expression breaking slightly, not fully, not in a way that felt complete, but enough to show that she was starting to see what I was saying, even if she did not want to accept it entirely. And she said they did not know how to handle it back then, that they thought it was the right decision, that they believed it would teach me responsibility. And hearing those words again, even after all this time, did not hurt the way it once would have. It just confirmed what I already understood, that they had justified their choices in a way that allowed them to move on, without ever facing the impact of what they had done. I nodded slightly, acknowledging what she said without agreeing with it, and I told them that maybe that was true. Maybe they did believe that. But the result was still the same. I had been alone, I had built my life without them, and I had learned what it meant to move forward without expecting anything from the people who were supposed to be there for me, and that was not something I was going to undo now. The space between us felt different then, not tense, not chaotic, but defined, clear in a way it had never been before, because for the first time, everything was out in the open, not hidden behind assumptions or expectations, not shaped by their version of events, but grounded in the reality of what had actually happened, and I could see it in their faces. They had not come prepared for this version of the story. They had not expected me to stand there the way I was, calm, certain, unshaken, and I knew in that moment that whatever they said next, whatever they tried to do, it was not going to change the outcome, because the truth had already done what it needed to do. It had taken away the illusion they had walked in with, and there was no way for them to rebuild it. In the days that followed that encounter, nothing dramatic happened. There was no sudden reconciliation, no unexpected messages, no attempt to rewrite what had already been said, and that in itself felt like a kind of closure I had never truly experienced before, because for the first time, I was not waiting for something from them, not hoping for a different outcome, not holding on to the possibility that things might change. I was simply moving forward, steady and certain, into a life that I had built on my own terms. My days returned to a rhythm that felt familiar now, early mornings, structured routines, responsibilities that I had earned, and while my life was not perfect, it was mine, shaped by choices I had made rather than expectations that had been placed on me, and there was a quiet kind of peace in that, not loud, not overwhelming, but consistent in a way I had never known before. Sometimes, I still think about that night, the porch, the suitcase, the version of me who stood there believing that losing everything meant the end of her story, and I wish I could tell her that it was not the end, that it was the beginning of something she could not yet see, something stronger, something more honest, something that would teach her that her value was never tied to someone else's approval. What I learned through all of this is that family is not defined by who has the title, it is defined by who shows up when it matters, by who stands beside you when things are difficult, and sometimes, the hardest truth to accept is that the people you expected to be there might not be the ones who actually are. And that does not make you less worthy, it just means you have to build something different, something real. If you are listening to this and you have ever felt abandoned, misunderstood, or pushed aside by the people who were supposed to support you, I want you to know that your story does not end there. That moment does not define you, and even if it feels like everything has been taken away, there is still something within you that cannot be taken. Your ability to keep going, to rebuild, to create a life that reflects who you truly are, not who others expected you to be. Thank you for staying with me through this story, for listening, for allowing me to share something that shaped me in ways I am still understanding. because sometimes just being heard is part of the healing. And if this story meant something to you, I would love to hear where you are listening from and what time it is where you are right now. And only if this story truly resonated with you, you can like and subscribe so we can continue sharing these moments together. My name is Emily Carter. I am 32 years old. And the lesson I want to leave with you is that you are allowed to walk away from people who only remember you when they need something, and you are allowed to build a life where your worth is not something you have to prove.